on Haven Street, and those of you out there in cyberspace joining us on the live stream. My name is Chris Reel. I am the owner of a company called Rent-A-Tour. We do guide services and itinerary planning all around the Baltimore region. I'm also the immediate past president of the Baltimore Tourism Association and the chair of the Maryland Tourism Coalition. And I'm very happy to be here today to talk about technology in tourism. And I've been in the tourism industry now for about 15 years. And one of the first things I realized about this industry is that the most important part of what we do is personal interaction, human interactions. That goes for guide services, that goes for museum visits, that goes for hotels and restaurants. Those personal interactions are a critical part of our industry. And I can remember March the 12th, 2020, a date that will forever live in infamy. It was a Baltimore Tourism Association meeting at the Capitol Grill downtown when we were all fully just starting to understand the magnitude of what was about to happen around the world with the pandemic. We were still there at our meeting. We had some hand sanitizer that we were giving away. We were sort of joking about some of our groups that had started to cancel. Nobody was really sure about what was going to happen, but there was a great deal of concern. And of course, that same day is when the NCAA tournament was canceled and baseball canceled opening day, and everything changed forever. So there was a lot of uncertainty and a lot of concern about what would happen in the tourism and hospitality industry. Again, an industry where personal contact is so important. Overnight, we weren't allowed to have that personal contact anymore for everybody's own safety. So we started to think about ways that we could stay viable, ways that we could continue to deliver our products to our customers, and technology became a critical part of that consideration. So I'm really pleased to be joined here today by two of my colleagues in the industry. We're going to have a discussion about how we have managed to, I know we use this word too much these days, but we managed to pivot during the pandemic and find ways to connect with our customers through technology during the pandemic, and how we're going to continue using that technology moving forward. So to my right is Enrica Jang, who is the Executive Director of Poe Baltimore and the Edgar Allan Poe House and Museum, and also the Treasurer of the Greater Baltimore History Alliance. Hi, Enrica. Thank you for being here. And next to Enrica is Sean Hearn, who is the Executive Director of the Babe Ruth Birthplace Museum and Foundation and the President of the Greater Baltimore History Alliance. So representing two very important historic homes in our city, homes that have a connection to some great American icons. So thank you both for being here today. I think I'd like to start just by asking both of you to talk a little bit about your properties and what you offer, basically what it is that you do pre-pandemic, what your museums are all about, and you know, the message that you're trying to get out to your potential guests. So Enrica, why don't you start?
I tell people I'm very fortunate. I'm director over at the Edgar Allan Poe House and Museum, a tiny house museum in West Baltimore, literally only 620 square feet. People come to the city expecting the House of Usher, but instead they find the tiny home that where Poe began his career, the modest way that he lived with family. And it is the last surviving home in the city where Poe lived with family. The power of Poe is a very important thing for the city of Baltimore, especially our tourism here. He lives here now. We have the body. He's buried here. And so a lot of people associate Poe with the city. So we benefit from that, but we're still challenged as a small house museum. And so before the pandemic, open Thursday through Sunday from 11 to 4, we were limited in the number of people we could have at Poe House anyway, physically, just in this space, and then not being able to have anyone. Of course, everybody struggled the same way. So I hope that gives you a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Poe definitely intrinsically linked to Baltimore, became a professional writer here in Baltimore, and he's still here. He never left. Right? Sean, tell us a little bit about the Babe Ruth Birthplace Museum.
Well, my guy is the exact opposite. He was born here in Baltimore. Nobody associates him with Baltimore, and he's not buried here. And most people don't, even from Baltimore, know that Babe Ruth was born in Baltimore. But we run the Babe Ruth Birthplace. It's 4 Baltimore row houses on Emory Street. We are also the official Orioles Museum, and we are the official archive of the Baltimore Colts. We dedicate ourselves to all of Maryland's sports heritage. And COVID was a good and bad thing. And when you were talking a few minutes ago, I was thinking, if you remember when this all started, it was supposed to be for 1 week, and we were going to flatten the curve. So when we shut down, I thought we're going to close for a week or two, and this thing's going to go away. So we didn't pivot. We kind of staggered like we were drunk the first month, trying to figure out what we were going to do as this thing continued to linger and get worse.
Yeah, well, that's a good transition then. So the pandemic happens. We realize it's not going to be over in just a matter of weeks. We've got to find a way to keep the lights on. So how did your attraction use technology to stay connected with those guests?
Well, the Babe Ruth Museum, I tell everybody we're squirrels. We spend the summer gathering up nuts, hoping that we can get through the winter. We are traditional tourism. Our visitor base comes during the baseball season, and the most of it comes in the middle of summer. So opening day is our lifeline when we come out of operating in the red and start operating in the black. And that didn't happen. Baseball season was delayed and then delayed again and then delayed deep into the summer. So we were already in trouble when the pandemic hit. And the best thing that happened to me was I got a call from 2 board members who are very prominent philanthropists here in Baltimore and said, "What's your payroll?" And I gave them a number. I said, "My payroll is about $25,000 a month." And she said, "Okay, we're going to write you a check for $25,000. Don't lay anybody off until we can figure this out." And that got us to an emergency campaign with our board to keep the lights on, that then got us to PPP and all the other programs. So we managed to survive. But if they hadn't stepped up, we would have laid everybody off, and Lord knows if we'd be back open today.
So that was a big benefit coming in, having the groundswell of support and sort of the name recognition. Once you realized, though, that this was going to be more than just a matter of months, what are some of the things that you started to do using maybe social media platforms or video content to stay connected with your guests?
Well, the first thing that we did, besides Babe Ruth, was the Greater Baltimore History Alliance, which is a consortium of history attractions, museums, sites in and around Baltimore area. And a bunch of us got together, and the first thing we did is we started pounding on Visit Baltimore. What are you going to do? And then we started pounding on City Council, and then we started pounding on Annapolis. And the American Alliance of Museums, which is sort of the governing body of all museums, had estimated that 30% of museums weren't going to survive the pandemic. And fortunately, that number didn't come to fruition yet, but we hammered that, first of all. Because the mayor's office was issuing decrees and museums and aquarium were never mentioned. We didn't know where we fit. Could we reopen? Could we have people outside? So we were still trying to figure out those basic things. Once that was underway behind the scenes, then we thought, how do we connect with people? How do we continue? We had members who had bought membership. They still wanted something, and everybody was now at home. So we did some very rudimentary programs, and when I say rudimentary, it was an iPhone in our vault holding up artifacts in our collection going, "Isn't this neat?" This is, it was very rudimentary, but we were getting responses from people. And so it began to evolve from there, and social media was only a small piece of it because everybody is sent home, so fundraising stopped, marketing stopped. We're museums, we're archaic to begin with, so we weren't operating in the cloud. We were operating on desktop computers traditionally, so we had to do a rotation where each staff member was allowed to come in one day and try to get stuff done. We tried to route the phones to our cell phones. We tried to put on this face that it was normal, even though it wasn't normal. And I say this in the context of understanding that COVID was a pandemic and people suffered, people lost their lives, a lot of people got sick. But there were some positives that have come out of it in terms of how museums operate. And Chris and I were talking earlier, I've been championing for years that museums need to change. Our industry has become dinosaurs, and if we don't evolve, we're going to die. If we're no longer relevant, then we just go away. And the public libraries did it, 10 years ago. If you go into a public library today, it's not an elderly librarian that shushes you when you walk in the door. They're programmatic, they're alive, there's kids around, there's always something going on. And museums have been a little bit behind that. I think COVID forced us out of our boxes, out of our shells, out of our closets to try stuff.
Yeah, Enrica, same question for you. Again, a small museum, in-person contact is now not an option. So how did you use technology to stay connected with those guests?
I was listening to Sean and just feeling very, very envious of all the things that he said. Well, we only had this, we only had this. I didn't have any of that stuff either. I'm the only full-time employee for PO Baltimore, the nonprofit that actually runs the museum. So all museums at the time, the buzz was, all right, flip to social media, put that content up there. I did not have the time to spend on Facebook coming up with such content, or the time to compose tweets, to actually spend all that time, because social media, as wonderful it is, as far-reaching as it is, takes a lot of time. And marketing folks out there know exactly what I'm talking about. There's a lot that goes into it, and so it wasn't just a matter of like fling some Facebook posts up there. I had to be very judicious with time. I had a lot of grants I immediately had to start applying for. And I will give, the state of Maryland actually did offer quite a bit of technology, small grant technology that we could apply for, but we had to figure out what. We, the royal we, I and Poe had to figure out what we were going to apply for and like how we were going to do it. I was immediately intrigued by all of the virtual tours I was seeing, and I took one. Company in Italy. My husband and I had visited Italy, so I felt that I'll understand a little bit maybe about what I'm kind of looking at and what they're doing and try to piece it apart. So I took a virtual tour. The tour guide's the name of the company in Italy, and saw that they were immediately able to put together a video presentation that they could sell as a virtual tour. It immediately allowed people to talk to one another, which they were desperate to do. It was a live experience that they could have. It wasn't just something on social media where you're like typing. You could come up onto a Zoom and you could talk to one another and talk to the guide. And so, and it was a great communal experience. Somebody in London, somebody in Alabama, all of these people on the same tour talking to each other around the world. And I remember even tearing up that experience, and I wanted to be able to offer that. So that was something that Poe House could immediately do. So I applied for a small tech grant that was offered by the state of Maryland. We got $400 to buy a GoPro camera. And then I put the thing on my forehead, and I walked through Poe House, and a first-person tour of this tiny 620 square foot hut, trying not to kill myself as I'm like walking up the stairs with this GoPro on my forehead, climbing back down the stairs, but giving people this first-person experience. And then I had the video footage, and then when I started to do the video, I keep saying we. When Poe and I started to do the video tours, I was able to talk over this video footage, this first-person footage, and give people this sense as I'm talking to them. Even though they're watching a video, they're still talking to me, and I was able to answer questions. So that immediately was something that, rather than flinging this content up on Facebook, we could offer virtual tours. It's something that people paid for to do because it was a personal, sometimes even just one-on-one, but groups of 20, groups of 50 coming on, and then they could talk to one another, that we could talk about Poe, we could talk about these things. And that was the thing that really kind of got us through that time. And then that freed me up to be able to keep writing those grants and keep applying for PPP, keep my job, and then keep Poe House open.
Well, I can tell you from personal experience that those Poe virtual tours were so much fun. And Enrica and I have worked together for a little while now. Again, me as a tour guide, telling stories about Edgar Allan Poe is one of my favorite things to do for groups that come to Baltimore. But it is difficult sometimes when you have a motor coach of 50 people. You're not going to get all of them into Poe House. But during the pandemic, we were able to do tours for larger groups. Could have a group of 100 people all going through Poe House at exactly the same time, virtually. And Enrica was generous enough to offer me the opportunity to lead some of those tours, which was really a cool experience. I met people from all over the world. I became Twitter followers. We were reciprocal Twitter followers. I still keep in touch with some of them today. Big Poe fans from the UK, from other parts of the United States, and people who, pandemic or not, may have never had an opportunity to visit Baltimore were able to see this important part of Baltimore history virtually. And I think that was really, really powerful. And you mentioned getting emotional. There was this connection that I think a lot of us hadn't felt for a little while. And even though we were talking to each other via the internet, it still felt like we were in a room together, which was something that was very powerful, I think.
Yeah. That idea, too, of people who could not have otherwise, certainly nobody was traveling at that time, but people who would not necessarily have been able to come out to Baltimore anyway, or ever have been able to afford to do it. And also talk about innovation and ability to actually get to the third floor. Some people who would not have been able to climb stairs to have that first person experience. One thing, listening to Sean, I did want to sort of say is, it was absolutely true that before the pandemic, all of the things that you might have proposed in a meeting or proposed to your board, like, wouldn't it be cool if we had this innovative new technology thing that we could do at the museum? All of those things tend to fall down the list as you've got priorities for the electric bill or this kind of stuff. And social media sometimes trying to pitch that to a board, like the importance of that, how that's going to translate to dollars eventually. That's hard sometimes to pitch. When the pandemic hit, everybody was like, why don't you have this yet? Why don't you have this apparatus yet? Why aren't you putting out these videos on YouTube and Facebook? Like, why aren't you doing this now? And it's like, and we had to come up with something very fast.
So again, this was a catastrophe that happened all across the globe, but it did sort of push the innovation.
You had to.
There was no choice.
Well, it pushed the innovation, but it also created another problem, which was, it was fine that we were moving our content into a social media world, but there was no way to monetize it. So me doing programs on YouTube and Twitter and all this other stuff that we were doing still didn't replace bodies coming through the front door and paying admission. And we struggled to try to figure out, how do we continue to generate funds to stay in business? And in the traditional museum world, we have what I call the producers and the consumers. Your marketing and development people do the things that generate money, and then your educators and curators spend that money. And in time, there's been friction between those. That went away immediately because we all had to figure out, how do we monetize this? And how do we find ways in? And that changed as we went along, too. So our first year, we do a event every year called Babe's Birthday Bash. It's an in-person event, informal. We get former athletes and media people to come and talk on a variety of sport topics. We couldn't do that, so we went virtual. And we found out, again, people expect social media programs, virtual programs, to be free. They don't expect to pay for them. So that was a big challenge. So we went network TV route. We found sponsors for each of the session that got to speak at the beginning or introduce whoever was the panelist. Those programs were free to the public. If you wanted to participate in a live Q&A afterwards, you paid for that. And that worked the first year. Didn't work the second year when everyone now had virtual burnout and they didn't want to be on Zoom anymore. And part of that, too, is, I'm in my 50s. When they said we need to go on Zoom, I thought it was a TV show from a kids show in the 1970s. So I'm like, Zoom, what is that? And my demographic at the museum tends to skew older. Trying to get people in their 60s and 70s on Zoom. Now, we got Brooks Robinson, 86 years old, to go on Zoom. We had to send somebody out to set it up for him. So then all of a sudden, we had to become tech support. We had people who were signing up to participate in this program who are in their 60s and 70s, never been on Zoom before, and it's not working. That's not their fault in their mind. That's our fault that it's not working. So all of a sudden, we had to create tech support for any program that we did and start the program 10 minutes later because we knew we were going to have a bunch of people who couldn't log on. And we didn't have the people. None of us were tech support people. So, but we bumbled through that. And again, I think the positive thing for us is it allowed us now to explore topics in our mission that we couldn't do before within the confines of the Babe Ruth Museum. It allowed us, we have talked about developing a virtual classroom and studio for 10 years. We're doing that now because during the pandemic, when some schools went back, we started doing virtual classroom visits and have been quite successful with those. We can now reach kids that could never come to the Babe Ruth Museum. And that isn't kids that are in Montana. We can reach them, but we're also talking inner city schools where transportation is a big issue. And you can't bring a bunch of 4th or 5th graders from one of Baltimore City's schools because transportation is a huge barrier. We can now visit their school virtually instead. So there were some wins, but we haven't figured out yet, even to this day, how to pay for them all.
Yeah, so you kind of touched on this already, Sean, but even as we're moving through the pandemic and hopefully past the pandemic, do you anticipate that you're going to continue offering these types of virtual programs? I think you're right, there is some virtual burnout, but is there still a benefit to having those types of programs available for people who might not be able to visit the museum in person? Rika, why don't you start with that?
I tell everybody, once you go virtual, you can't go back. No matter how much you have in person, no matter how much many bodies you get back to the museum, anything like that. Once you have those programs out there, you can't not do them anymore. The benefit, one of the services that we could offer the community, especially during the pandemic, was teachers who were still meeting with their groups online. We tried to offer the tours for free to any school, any teacher who wanted to bring their kids for a session, do an hour, that kind of thing. And so that's where Chris came in. A lot of schools, a lot of, and a lot of these schools wouldn't have been able to afford the transportation, the buses for a field trip anyway. So being able to reach those kids, those are very much still in demand. As much as the Zoom fatigue did set in, and so our demand for the virtual tours from the general public has kind of dropped off. What hasn't dropped off is the demand from senior centers, and schools have not dropped off at all because teachers are always faced with shortage of dollars and how do you get those buses. So you can offer free admission all day for those kids, but they can't get there. So that there's a high demand for that. So there's that. We too do an annual event, the International Edgar Allan Poe Festival. We pivoted to virtual. We had an entirely virtual festival in 2020, programming all day long, hours of programming, this kind of thing, performances, video footage, combination of those things, putting that together with a live host. But now that even though the festivals come back in person, we do see the value, and you do want to continue to broadcast that stuff on YouTube. You do want to put that stuff on Facebook Live. That's how people, we literally did see the people who viewed the festival, the virtual festival, made it a point to come out when the thing finally came live, and that continues. So education, senior centers, that demand is still there. So some things are still very much in demand, Zoom fatigue or not. This is what people can afford. You might like meeting people in person. Zoom meetings are still the most easiest thing to try to coordinate with people and get them there. So those things just don't go away, and so that's where we are.
Yeah, we had wanted to move to a virtual model anyway. The Babe Ruth Museum is really small. We can't handle large buses of people at one time, so it's always been a challenge. And Baltimore County was telling me, their representative, that it costs $700 per bus to bring a group of kids to a museum. So if you're bringing 3 buses of 5th graders, that's $2,100 just in transportation costs. That's not the admission to the attraction, that's not lunch, that's just transportation costs. So we've been fighting an uphill battle for a while. So I think the virtual model has some real advantages. It has some disadvantages. In-person contact is better. We are trying to figure out the hybrid model. How can we do programming in person and still have a virtual component to it that works? But the example that I give, Babe's Birthday Bash, we had Brooks Robinson here in Baltimore, Jim Palmer in Arizona, Boog Powell in Florida, and John Miller in San Francisco as the MC. That program would not have been possible if we had to fly them all into Baltimore. And it was supposed to go 40 minutes. It went an hour and a half. It was a huge success. So it has created new opportunities for us, transportation and distance. We can now have conversations. We can now have panels. We can now have programs that we couldn't before. It also allowed us to expand our programming on topics, as I said before. We developed a series called How About That? And there are these little 3-minute videos that tells a piece of the story you may never heard before. So the last one we just did is the woman who started the at every Orioles and now Ravens game. While Bill Hagee gets credit for it, he kind of launched it publicly, but Mrs. Powers is the one who started it. So we had her come in and tell the story. Same thing, Oriole Park at Camden Yards is what makes Oriole Park unique is that the principal designer was a woman, Janet Marie Smith. Most people don't know that. So during Women's History Month, Janet came in and talked about her role in designing Oriole Park at Camden Yards. We couldn't do that before because she's in Los Angeles. New opportunities came out of it, but new challenges. And what we're now dealing with, and I don't know if you're dealing with this, our school programming, the technology is not compatible. It's like the old days when Windows and Mac were not compatible. You know, if you were a Windows user and you saved files, that was it. That's the only format you had, and vice versa, you couldn't share. We're still dealing now with that with Zoom, Microsoft Teams, all of that. Every school has a different set of parameters. Many schools don't use Zoom and won't use Zoom. So we got to learn how to shift. We haven't technologically evolved into one that works and you flip a switch and says this school's using Teams, this school's using proprietary education software, this school's using Zoom, and it's just a click of the switch. We haven't gotten there yet. So that's one of the biggest challenges, I think, in the evolution of the technology and innovation. We need to get there. So if anyone's working on that, please work faster because we certainly need that.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Sean. That was actually one of my next questions.
I keep jumping ahead of your question.
Well, yeah, you're leading me right where I want to go, so thank you. Now, what do you think could be improved about the technology? Obviously, we've come an awful long way. I don't think anybody had ever heard of Zoom before March 2020. There was video conferencing, but nothing like what we see now. And I know that Zoom has improved quite a bit over the past 2 years. I remember the first time I was on a Zoom call, there were all kinds of challenges with it, and they've just continued to update their platform and their product, and I think it gets better seemingly every time I log on. There's a new update, and it seems like it's a little bit more user-friendly. I know that some of the schools that you're talking about that won't use Zoom maybe have security concerns, but not just Zoom. With any of the technological platforms that we're using or the programs that we're using for shooting and editing video content, what kind of advances would you like to see to make those products more user-friendly for what you're doing?
Well, I think the biggest issue is that they're all expensive. We were not budgeting them prior. So we had to pivot for online fundraising. So we went to a subscription service called GiveSmart, which allowed us to do our virtual bash, have live feed, but have a silent auction running at the same time, have sponsors running across the bottom. But that's $2,500 a year that we didn't budget. So if you want to make a donation to the museum, you can pick up the phone and call me, and I run a credit card through USA ePay, or you can go online and it runs through USA ePay. If you come into the museum, it's a different service, and if you go through GiveSmart, it's a different service. If I need to send out an announcement, sometimes I'm using Constant Contact, sometimes I'm using MailChimp. Every one of these is costing money, and it's a patchwork. One of them does something really well, the other one doesn't. And nobody has come up with one that can kind of do it all. So it's costing us a lot of money, and it's sometimes very inefficient. We can use Facebook Live on GiveSmart. YouTube doesn't work as well. Part of the embedding, we've had to become computer IT people in the process. So that's my issue, is that it's not seamless, and we're spending a lot of time trying to figure out how to get the content out. We don't have a problem developing the content. We know our topics, but I've joked that there's a whole lot of magic and voodoo in there, that we haven't figured out, and I'm not sure anyone has figured out yet.
I, like Sean, I do find that our approach has to be patchwork because as is such a small organization, I trying to sort of make the magic happen by the kinds of services that don't require that customization, because everybody knows that customization obviously very expensive. And there are companies out there who can do anything for you. It's a matter of, as soon as you get into this special thing that you've got to do and you're trying to sort of like rig it from behind, then it becomes very patchwork. And then you've got to be on all the payment services. You have all the QR codes. You have to do all this stuff. And then you find there are websites that offer to streamline all of that for you too. So it's this other thing you've got to have an account for a fee and these kinds of things. And I think now more than ever, things are possible for a small organization like mine. We can sell tickets with the big kids. We can do, and each of the platforms has their own kind of promotion built in, that kind of thing. So as a small organization, I'm looking for something that isn't going to cost us money. Like, the company's not going to make money unless we make money, and those are the things we're looking for. But that's why so many things are patchwork and stuff like that. I think that one of the things that I would wish lists that I give, the ticketing company that we work with, wish lists that I give, even with social media, is helping us use their service in the ways, like if we can give a wish list, they come with solutions like, we might not be able to do this custom thing for you, but this is how this could work, and this is how to explain it to the people, to your constituents, if you will. This is how to explain it to your attendees. Because we are not tech support, we had to become tech support, so we're trying to understand it and teach people how to use their computers. And that was there was a lot of that. And so for any vendor to be able to say, okay, we see what you want, we know what you want, this is how to use our service to accomplish that. It might not be a custom solution for you, but this might be better. And working with us in that way some companies can do that, others don't.
Yeah, I think a lot of us had to become IT professionals over the past 2 years. Those of us that have no experience at all with computers are finding ourselves walking through troubleshooting with people who might not understand what's going on. And something that you both brought up, which is, I think, really an important consideration, is the cost of some of these things. At a time when nonprofit museums are struggling in the first place, it's not always feasible to go out and subscribe to all of these different services, even though they might do exactly what you need them to do. So are there ways that these companies, maybe they're already doing it, can offer discounts for nonprofits? You mentioned some grants and other sources of funding. Those sources of funding can be used toward those technology platforms?
Some of it can, and actually what happened during this is we all spoke to each other. So keep in mind, we're talking about tourism. The tourism industry nearly collapsed. Restaurants laid everybody off. Some of them closed permanently. Hotels, some of them closed permanently during this. Visit Baltimore went to a skeletal staff. Visit Maryland went to a skeletal staff. So even people that we were able to rely on were gone. And we suddenly were like, we're on our own here. Learning how to promote each other, and we would talk to each other. And Enrique, I remember one day, I said, did you apply for such and such a grant? I'm like, I didn't know about such and such a grant. I'm very happy she called that day because I got $25,000 out of that grant. So there was that kind of sharing going on. But a whole bunch of people made money during the pandemic, and a whole bunch of people lost money. A lot of those companies that you're talking about tried to swoop in, like, we're going to help you, but they didn't offer discounts, okay? And I still don't think people completely understand how close the tourism industry came near to total collapse. One of the aftermath still is that the school systems and businesses like yours lost drivers because there's no bus drivers. We're not busing kids to school. We're not sending seniors on trips up and down the East Coast. And all of a sudden, we're all at home buying from Amazon, and Amazon and UPS are scooping up people with CDL licenses to drive, and we haven't been able to get them back. And that's why we see on the news that, where there's a shortage of drivers. they just went to work for Amazon and all those other companies and got paid better. And let's be honest, dealing with busloads of kids, they should have gotten a medal plus some for what they did. So we continue to struggle in the recovery. Some businesses have recovered. We have not recovered. We took out an SBA loan for this year, and for next year, we're running a budget deficit. I've got to find $100,000 out of a $425,000 budget. My revenue projection is $300,000, and my expenses are $425,000, and we haven't figured out how to do that yet because visitors haven't completely come back yet. And that's a big part. We're not doing galas at full capacity yet because there's a lot of people who are still not comfortable being in a ballroom with 600 other people. So the recovery is going to take a while. And when I started earlier and said that 30% of museums may not survive, I don't think we're out of the woods yet. Some of the smaller museums, I think, pivoted quicker than we did because they didn't have all the baggage that the bigger museums struggled. They had huge staffs. They had huge staffs of educators that they didn't know what to do with. Some of them just laid them all off and said, we'll call you when this is over. Others tried to find new things for them to do. The smaller ones, I think, were quick. Baltimore Heritage was a great example. The Women's Heritage Center, very quick to pivot and do some really cool, innovative stuff. But I'm off track.
No, that's good. I mean, you're making a really good point. It's certainly worth mentioning that the industry is not out of the woods yet, and there are still challenges that lie ahead. I do think that the technology we've managed to figure out how to use to our advantage is helping us stay afloat. But again, it's expensive, and there needs to be a way to monetize that, and ultimately to get people back through the doors. Right? I mean, at the end of the day, that's still the goal, is to get people physically into these museums, right?
Well, I think yes and no. I think, yes, to get people through the door is important, but I think we've learned along the way that we have a mission to preserve and interpret Maryland sports history, and we can do that now in ways that we didn't think we could do before the pandemic. So that's been really one of the pluses, in that we can move some of this technology to supplement and augment what we're doing within our bricks and mortar structures. But I also think that with those opportunities, we've got to figure out, again, how to monetize it. So for us next year, we're exploring going to a subscription model for our virtual programs. So we're going to offer 5 virtual programs with some headliners, and if you want to participate in those, you're going to buy a subscription that gets you access to all 5. And then once those programs are done in a few months, then we'll put them on YouTube and make them free to people. But if you want to participate live, there's going to be a fee. We have to find ways to generate the revenue to still cover the overhead. I'm paying a crew right now $1,000 a month to do our video production. A year before COVID, we never even thought about adding that. That's an expense that I've got to figure out how to pay them.
Your question is more about recovery. What
Yeah,
we're doing.
kind of moving forward. We talked about the fact that we're going to continue using technology, but how important is it to actually get people back into the museums and into through the door?
Well, our model has almost changed entirely, and we, because of some of the toys that we got as a result, call them toys, but they were very, very important. Because of the grant funding that we got, we now have an app that we can offer, and it is with a company we use, QZM, and we use their app, and it's something that, again, does not require a lot of customization, but it's something that we can continue to build on. And so one of the things we had to focus on is we still can't allow a lot of people in Poe House, physically can't get them in there anyway. But now with COVID and no modern ventilation system, we're on a reservation-only basis. So the only answer was to get a higher amount of money per visitor. And the only way to do that was to offer these virtual things. We were unable to offer a membership to the Edgar Allan Poe House and Museum before the pandemic because a tiny 620 square foot, and if you love Poe and you want to keep giving to Poe just to support the house, we have a lot of donors who do that, but not a big pool of folks. But the one thing that came out of all of the content that we had to create is now we have a content library. And by pulling some of that stuff off after it was broadcast, now we have an entire library of things that we are about to launch our virtual membership that we would not have been able to offer before. It's something that we might, again, one of those things I would have presented as a possibility, but now we have days of content that we can put up there that people want to come back and see. So that was something we had to kind of build.
Yeah, and so the pandemic has sort of offered an opportunity for proof of concept.
Yes.
You can see now that this works and that people are engaging with it. And so when you go and look for these sources of funding from maybe grantees or from a board, they can see that this works and this is a good investment.
But the tricky thing about that too is like that Coke or Pepsi, everybody's got their favorites. Everybody like favorites in Zoom, favorites in meetings, these technologies that like don't talk to each other. Not only do you have to, like the landscape is constantly changing, but you have to kind of pay attention to. I don't understand Instagram. I don't, it seems like it's the easiest thing to understand, but I don't, and TikTok and all that stuff. And so I could give you YouTube, I could give you Twitter. How do we, a small organization like ours, pivoting the way the landscape does so quickly, that's hard.
Well, that's a great segue too, because I wanted to ask you about social media. I know that when we were forced to stop giving in-person tours, I went down in my basement, and we have a room in our house with no windows. When we moved into the house, my wife said, I don't care what you do with this room, I'm never going to go in here. So there were a lot of unpacked boxes in that room, and when the pandemic started, she was working from home, so she kicked me out of my office, and I went down into the basement to the room where all the unpacked boxes were, and I turned it into a little studio. I set up a webcam and some lights, and I put some old Oriole pennants and skipjack pennants up on the wall, Mr. Bo poster, and I think it looks pretty cool. So whenever I'm on Zoom, that's my backdrop, and I started making YouTube videos. And I haven't necessarily gone full bore into that, maybe as much as I could have, because it does take time to research the videos and make the videos and do them right. But got over 150 subscribers in a pretty short period of time, and I think that's something I know I want to continue doing. I want to continue putting content on my YouTube page related to Baltimore. So I've got a Twitter feed, I've got a Facebook page. What social media platforms have you found work best for what you want to get across, and how are you using them? What platforms are you using to reach different audiences, and how is the message changing between those platforms, if at all?
As I just said, it's a struggle, just me personally. This is my field, and it's up to me to educate myself on how to utilize these things and all of the research that goes into it. So I try to read a lot of articles. I try to sort of be up on it. Nothing beats having someone on your staff who understands these things and knows what's going to connect with folks, or knows how to very quickly and be very nimble across so many different platforms. I think the challenge is just understanding, as professionals, where we should be putting this stuff up, and understanding the analytics. I can figure out how to put up a video. I have someone who sort of like, it's like reading hieroglyphs to me, and so like they interpret what my analytics are telling me and where we should be going. We had an entire session the other day about which hashtags to actually put on things, and again, it's for the folks who might be watching. It seems like it might be very easy for those guys. For us, very small organizations, having someone on staff who can understand those things. It's not even so much which social platforms are the most successful, but getting to where the people are and getting your message out there, and then understanding the data that's coming back to you so you can fix it.
Yeah, Sean, real quick, I like to think of it as, having a social media expert. It's like you would hire an accountant to do your books because they're an expert in that particular field. I wouldn't try to do my books on my own because I'd probably mess it up. I think a lot of us feel like, oh yeah, I can do social media, but there are people who really understand this to a level far beyond my understanding. And I think it is important to have people that are dedicated to that if it's in the budget.
I agree, but I've also learned that just because they understand social media doesn't mean they understand you. And so we just went through this exercise. I'm the executive director, and I'm challenging my team, and there's 6 of us on different levels working on our social media. Some of us, the older people, work on the content side. We can tell the sports stories, we know the history. We have some people who do the production. They're doing the cameras, and they're doing the laptops, and they're filming, and they're creating. And then we have a couple that do the distribution. And they don't know any of the content. And so I got my team together because my board wants to know, what's the return on this? And so I asked my team, and keep in mind, I have a 21-year-old who I just hired who said, we have to be on TikTok, we have to be on TikTok, we have to be on TikTok. She doesn't understand the content side. And then we have dinosaurs like myself and our historian who's in his 70s, who it's all magic and voodoo. So I pulled the team together and said, why? They could tell me how many click-throughs, they could tell me how it got uploaded, but they couldn't tell me why. And so we sat around, and for those of us who are older, we remember life before social media. Some of us remember life before computers. My grandmother remembered life before electricity, so it's all relevant. But a bunch of my team has never experienced life without social media. So it's always been there. They've never asked why. So I posed the question, why? And we looked at all of our platforms, and I called them tools. I said, we're not going to call it Facebook. We're going to call it the Facebook tool. We're going to call it the Instagram tool. We're going to call it the TikTok tool. And try that a couple times. What's our demographic? Who's on there? And what are we using this tool for? And it was really enlightening for all of us. And we kind of discovered that the museum's content, our mission-based stuff, was on YouTube. We were using that like a library, like a TV station, like an archive. We were using Facebook to promote our events. We were using Instagram to promote like local things and get your picture taken and use the hold a little thing that says Babe Ruth Museum with a hashtag on it to promote us locally. We were using Twitter to respond to immediate things happening in the news. Aaron Judge breaks Roger Maris's record today. We'll be on Twitter all day with that because it's happening right now. And then TikTok. And we kind of figured out different audiences, demographics, we needed to feed them back and forth. And once we went on TikTok, and I didn't understand TikTok, and I've got a 21-year-old who comes out of the front of the museum lip-syncing to Good Morning Baltimore, and I'm thinking, why are we doing this? Then I see all of the other numbers on our other platforms going up. Okay? So we kind of have now, and everyone, including the young one on TikTok, now understands how do we do one to promote the other, and linking those, and then linking the effort. If we are trying to drive people to an event, whether it's ours or whether it's yours, we have different platforms, which is the best tool to do that. So we now have a better understanding of the why. And I think we're going to keep doing that every so often and revisit. Why are we on these platforms? And if it's not working, do we need to be on this platform? So we'll evaluate in a few months whether we're going to stay on TikTok or not. Right now, I think we are. But because you're dedicating resources to all of them. And I hired a social media person. My board wants to know, what are we getting out of it? And they're board members. They monetize. We measure things qualitatively. We measure things on, are our visitors happy? Did we, do a great education program? Board members want to see numbers. How many people were there? How much money did it generate? How many click-throughs did it have? Blah, blah, blah. So we're still maneuvering those waters to figure all that out.
I think we are just about out of time. So just anything you want to wrap up with here? Any outlook for the future? Any takeaways for people that are maybe also in our field in tourism and hospitality? Any advice you'd have for them before we close out here?
Well, anybody out there who has a lot to learn, I'm with you. I have a lot to learn. I'm going to pass that on to any final.
I try to challenge everybody to think about what's going on around you. If you know of resources and you think, you know what, I haven't been to the Babe Ruth Museum and I wonder if they know about this, this, or this. Don't think that we are sitting there having everything figured out, because most of the time we don't have everything figured out. We can quote baseball statistics to you far better than we can tell you about analytics, number one. But number two, and this goes no matter where you live, take an opportunity to stay home and and visit some of these sites, or go to their social media, or you might discover something that is completely new, pretty cool, and you might have something that you can offer to us and we can offer to you. I think what's exciting for us right now is that a lot of us are trying to find new ways to innovate with each other. So we're talking about developing like the famous Baltimoreans trail, so that it's an app or it's a PDF you download and you find out where the Poe House is, where the Babe Ruth House is, where Cab Calloway's house was, Mary Pickersgill's Flag House, and we do famous Baltimoreans. And then we'll do that also with industrial, and we'll do that with religious sites, and we'll do things. We want you to come back to us. That's the bottom line with tourism. We want you to come to our attractions. We want you to stay in our hotels, have a staycation with your spouse or your partner, visit a restaurant, spend money downtown, spend money wherever you live, because that's what keeps the whole machine going. And I think that's what we got to try to do, is find innovative ways to bring people back in. And we're looking for innovation from those around us to say, this is how we can partner. I think out of COVID, we have all, and not just museums, but all kinds of attractions have been getting together saying, how can we do something together that's a win-win for everybody?
Yeah, and I think that's a key point, Sean, is that word together. Working with all of us in the tourism industry and everybody out there, you can help us out by amplifying the message, by liking and sharing and reposting and all of that stuff to help boost that signal for us, because we're still trying, I think, many of us, to gain a foothold in that social media landscape. I think we had one question before we wrap up, or two questions, a couple questions. Yes, go ahead, in the back.
Hi, my name's Ellen Martha.
Hi, Ellen.
I'm a consultant, and I just did a project for the African American Tourism Council. You might know who they are. I've been listening to what you three of you have said. I've known Tex for the last 40 years. Question I have is, why is there two Baltimore tourism paths? There's one for Black Baltimore and one for White Baltimore. You, in the middle there, you're over at Edgar Allan Poe. You're in the middle of Poe homes. What are you doing to stop this segregation and get the local community to come into your museum, the Babe Ruth Museum as well? I'm getting a little tired of it, and I've been confronting Visit Baltimore for over the last 5 years, and I'm finally getting somewhere. How do we stop this? And how do we use tech to be more inclusive?
I'm American Indian, and if there was an American Indian Travel Council, I'd be all over that. So I don't think I want to stop it. I think it's a matter of understanding different demographics, travel, and visit locations for different reasons. I say it to my crew all the time. We don't have a demographic. We have multiple demographics. People come to our attractions for all different reasons, and we have to be aware of that. So, if there is 2 avenues, there's not 2 avenues. There's probably 10 avenues. We call it the alphabet soup in Baltimore, because you have the Baltimore Tourism Association, you have Visit Maryland, you have Visit Baltimore, you have the Downtown Partnership, and you have a bunch more, the Greater Baltimore History Alliance. We all have different goals. It's important that we work together and try to promote all of them, as opposed to saying we're only going to promote this pocket over here, because each one of those organizations has a slightly different mission and a different purpose. And I think being sensitive to those and understanding those and working those, it's an issue of always working with groups and saying, what can I do for you and what can you do for me? It's not a one-way street. So I don't think it's a bad thing. Never have. It's a different avenue. It's a different tool to get people in and around this city.
Your question was very specific, so I'm just going to, I agree. We share a lot of the same values in terms of working together as organizations, trying to be as involved as possible, and with the little time that we have. So I 100% echo Sean. Specifically for our organization, the history of the Edgar Allan Poe House used to be a duplex, and in 1940, Poe House, this house itself was actually scheduled for demolition to build the Edgar Allan Poe homes. The Edgar Allan Poe Society of Baltimore stepped in, begged the city to please save the house, and the compromise was to chop Poe House in half and build the housing project onto us. So we have been neighbors with the Poe homes named because Edgar Allan Poe lived there, and we have been neighbors for the last 75 plus years. And so being in the community, bringing in tourism, making sure that we are offering programs that are free, offering programs that are as open as possible, and trying to incorporate as much of the feedback as we get from the community. It's a continuing effort, and every single bit of free programming offered by an organization costs that organization lots of money. And so that investment is constant. That investment is part of the neighborhood that we're actually in. I want to give a short shout out to the Greater Baltimore History Alliance, but the Baltimore National Heritage Area, who really over the last 5 years has done a lot of work. We work with Shantae Daniels. She's to really make sure that our programming it begins to reflect those things. And we got a grant just this past year to talk about the history of the Poe homes, to talk about how our relationship as neighbors for 75 years, and make sure that as the neighborhood is changing, we're chronicling the history that we made together. So those kinds of efforts are always kind of happening. I think one of the themes of this session has been, you do have this content, how do you even get it out there? How do you, when you have to spend a lot of money on graphics creation and you have to spend a lot of money on staff time for content creation, you would be surprised how many organizations are sitting on a gold mine of history and information that we need that voice to actually get that out there. And I think that's what we've been talking about today, how to use innovation to kind of make sure that we can actually disseminate the knowledge that we have to better for the community.
And I just want to add, I think that tourism and hospitality is good for Baltimore. It's an economic driver. It supports a lot of jobs. And we in the industry need to do a better job of making sure that the entire city understands that we're here for everybody, not just for people that are coming in from other parts of the country or other parts of the state. These are assets that benefit Baltimoreans, and we want Baltimoreans to appreciate and enjoy these assets in their neighborhood. That's really, really important to us, and that's a message we really need to amplify.
And I've never perceived it to be competitive. I don't think having two different organizations working on tourism, that they're in competition with each other. I think, again, it's using the tools and reaching audiences and expanding the audience. So if one group is doing it better than another, maybe that's the way to go this particular time. But I don't think it's competition. If I can convince somebody to come to downtown Baltimore and they don't want to see the Babe Ruth Museum and they want to see Poe, Baltimore still wins. You know, so what I want to do is make sure that people have a quality experience, that we're changing perceptions about Baltimore, and you know, we're putting people back to work and creating jobs, and all of our attractions have a different story to tell to help make that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know we are over time right now, and if anybody else has any questions, I know we'll probably be hanging around for a little bit, but we've got to get the next speaker up here on stage. So thank you all very much for listening to us today, those of you here at Haven Street and those of you out in cyberspace, and we encourage you to come on down to Baltimore and visit some of these attractions and really explore the city. We would appreciate that. Thanks a lot.